Hey, you all. I send you a very warm welcome to my presentation today. I'm really glad you can join me. And it's this time of the year when I was usually very much looking forward to pack my suitcases and travel to the Cape to attend the conference and be with you in person, hang out, and just enjoy the beautiful landscape of the Cape Cod. But I'm also very grateful that Sherry managed to have this video presentation instead, and I hope you will enjoy it. Originally, the title of the presentation was quite long and it read like The Renaissance of Antiquity, Ancient Painting Techniques Reinterpreted. When I was thinking about the details of the presentation, though, I figured instead of giving you tons of details of the technique, you might also be interested in hearing about why I am working with these materials and what my journey was discovering and combining the two techniques. By the end, what you will hear is my story on how and why I'm combining these two ancient techniques and how I adapt them and push the materials for my own purpose. You will see examples from students' work that I made during the residency, having the fresco process explained in more detail, and hear about what's happening in the near future. So stay with me and let's start with my first frescoes that I made back in 2013. What you can see here were my two very first tries working with the fresco material back in 2013. So that's 12 years ago already. At the time, working with such raw, earthy substances was entirely new to me, and a whole new world opened up, and I absorbed all the possibilities like a sponge. What fascinated me most from the beginning was the serendipity nature of the process. The painting continues to evolve overnight, developing its own dynamic as it dries. So, returning to the studio the next morning always starts with a surprise and a moment of discovery. So, over all these years, what these materials have taught me is to let go, to learn finding the courage to take risks, starting to trust the process, and also finally at the end of the day to trust and rely on myself. So in my workshops I often see how this need for control and this longing for clear rules, hoping that these rules will turn you into a good painter and make your paintings work, ends up in this fear of taking risks, and that can seriously block your creative flow. So working with this process-based techniques like fresco really can open up a space for deep personal exploration instead, and it's a huge and steep learning curve if you trust the process. At the same time, I've always been drawn to the physicality of the materials, the density, their honesty, the direct tactile engagement required when preparing the surface. So the embodied connection remains essential to my painting practice. Like many of us, I draw a great deal of inspiration from nature, from architecture, from buildings, and not necessarily from the grand, majestic landscapes as a whole, but much rather from the details, and also the details that are often overlooked because they're not shiny, they're not beautiful, but they are there and they do have their history and stories to tell that probably are a lot more interesting than the beauty as such. To give you an example on how I find my inspiration, I would like to take you to Sicily. I went there on a trip in 2014 that was off season, and the hotels and guest houses were not yet prepared for guests, so they were dirty, and kind of the humidity over the winter left traces on floors and walls. And what you can see here is the balcony of one of these guest houses in the north of Sicily, just opposite of the Aeolian Islands. And to give you an example on what there is, if you look at the terrace as such, you wouldn't find anything specifically beautiful other than probably the view to the ocean. But if you look at the details, and these are photographs of the floor of this terrace that you've seen before, that are just absolutely amazing. So it's the close-up, it's the macro view that reveal their beauty in the small things, and not necessarily only if you look at the big picture. And it's this beauty of imperfections that are really a big inspiration for me. Here is an example on how that influences my practice. So on the right, again, there's another picture of this terrace that you've just seen. That was taken in 2014. And on the left is a quite recent painting I did with coal wax and oil and rust. And I think it's pretty obvious on how these two are connected, even though there's almost 10 years in between taking the photograph and painting the painting. The next one is the picture on the left, that is a rock face covered with moss, taken in the Italian-speaking part of Switzerland in the summer. And on the right-hand side, you see my interpretation of this photograph with a fresco on Kahari paper in 2019. Wax-based paints that are different from our encaustic paint was part of my work very early on, initially as a medium to create wax and oil paints that I used on my frescoes. On the first two paintings that I showed you, I created my own paints and colored parts of the frescoes with these wax-based paints. The recipes for the paints were taken from this book. It's called Materials and Painting Techniques by the German artist and professor Kurt Welte. He lived from 1907 to 1973. And for those of you who have never heard of him before, he was really known for his pioneering the X-ray technology to analyze paintings. And he was instrumental in several key counterfeiting processes where he detected and proved overpainting and forgeries. This book is quite a Bible. It spans over 570 pages and is a fantastic source of information. If you are interested in what kind of materials you're working with and want to learn more about different painting techniques, it is a must-have, I would say. The information on encaustic, however, is quite limited. It actually does not even cover a full page. And Welte mentions it only for the sake of completeness, because he's very thorough in mentioning all the painting techniques and describes it as a peculiar technique. And I think, in all fairness, that reflects the lack of diversity of encaustic painting that we have in Europe. This is why, on my quest to learn more about encaustic, I found out about the International Encaustic Conference and attended it for the first time in 2018. And that was when my real journey into encaustic started. Overwhelmed and deeply inspired by the variety of encaustic works displayed at the conference and in all the galleries in P-Town, I was captivated by its depth, luminosity, and transparency, and its unique presence. So when I got back home, my work with Fresco took a back seat for a few years until 2022. Again, Edgewood played a pivotal role on my journey, and particularly when I started my residency with Michael David in 2022. Here on the right side, together with Susan Fourier, who I shared the studio with during the residency. It was a fantastic experience, really. I absolutely enjoyed it. And I delved into the possibilities of combining these two techniques I have been working for so many years in the past. It was about creating a dialogue between fresco and encaustic that has since become a core part of my artistic work and expression. And looking back, the combination of these two ancient techniques arose quite naturally from my deep curiosity in materials. And it feels like a logical continuation of my journey. It's not so much a conceptual decision, but much more an intuitive one. And it's really where my passion is. And the fusion of these two has become essential on how I express myself in a very tactile and embodied way. This next part of the presentation is particularly for those of you who want to learn more about the technique. And I would like to present you Fresco in a nutshell, because there's a lot to say about the technique, but we don't have unlimited time. So just let me get you the most important parts of the technique. It is important to understand that there are basically two different types of frescoes. One is the so-called buon fresco, and the other one is the fresco secco. Both of them start with the same process, meaning the application of an arrigo and then the layering of intonaco on top of it. The difference is when and how the paint is applied. So if we look at this, probably the most famous example of a buon fresco made by Michelangelo in the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in Rome, he decided to go for a buon fresco. What you can see here is a photograph of the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And I would like to apologize for the quality. You probably don't see it too well. But what is important is just to give you an idea of the details that were painted on this masterpiece. So Michelangelo was commissioned by Pope Julius II to repaint the ceiling of the famous Sistine Chapel in Rome. He started the project by designing a scaffolding system to work on the very high ceiling of the chapel. He decided to work with a buon fresco technique, meaning he painted directly onto damp plaster. Before starting the painting process, he created full-scale preparatory drawings, the so-called cartoons. He used a method called pouncing to transfer the design onto the wet plaster. The way he did it is he poked tiny little holes in the cartoon and dusted charcoal through them to outline the sketch. Furthermore, he divided the ceiling into the so-called giornatas. These daily sections determined how much of fresh plaster was needed every day to complete the painting work of one single day. All in all, he divided it up into 570 different giornatas, so that was about a 3-year project. The buon fresco technique allows the pigments to bond with the plaster, creating a very durable and lasting image. The interesting thing to me is that the pigments were applied directly without being suspended in an additional binder that created a different color. In later sections, he may have worked freehand as his confidence grew. And for detailed work like faces, some scholars believe he might have also used the fresco secco technique and added some more detail on the already dried plaster. Probably the second most famous fresco painting is The Last Supper, painted by Leonardo da Vinci in Milan, in Italy. Leonardo worked on this mural for about 3 years, starting in 1495. And the mural covers the end wall of the monastery of the Santa Maria della Grazia in Milan, that you can see on the top right. And it measures 15 by 28 feet. Just imagine. Leonardo, as a painter, apparently favored oil painting because it was and is a medium that allows the artist to work slowly and make changes with ease. On a buon fresco, as we learned, that is quite the opposite, because the color can only be applied while the plaster is still wet or damp, and that creates additional timely pressure in the painting process Leonardo did not appreciate. That is why he worked on a fully cured and dried fresco surface, and the color he used was different to create a greater luminosity than can be achieved with the water-soluble colors used on a buon fresco. Leonardo painted The Last Supper in tempera, the painting medium that was generally used for panel paintings. Tempera colors, casein, or other water-soluble paints are mediums I love to use when I work on a dried fresco surface. This is again a very basic sketch of the buon fresco process. And what I would like to show you and point out is which parts of this fresco process I am using in my work. Because as you might have noticed, I'm not painting traditional murals. My work is not connected to the architecture. I work on substrates. And I am not a figurative painter. And I therefore don't do the cartoon tracing and the cartoon sketching. So in my process, what it comes down to is really we prepare different kinds of regios underneath. We apply the intonaco. Then we either work on a dried surface and continue with a fresco secco technique, or we immediately apply color to the still damp fresco surface and create buon frescoes. On the next slide, I will give you an overview on a variety of possible regio materials that you can use. Here is a sampler of what you can use underneath your intonaco layer to ensure that you have this base layer created in a sustainable way. So number one, these are just coffee grounds. That means it's brewed up coffee that you can apply on the surface. And what I like about the coffee, and you will see that in some examples later on, is that it kind of bleeds through. It's a dark regio. It has some color of its own, and it influences the drying process and creates some shades in the intonaco layer. Number two is a mixum of gypsum and coarse sand. There's also some color that fell into the regio, so that's where you have these black streaks. That's not really the sand, so that is some color pigment that fell into it. Now, number three is a mixture of travertine sand and marble dust that is very coarse. So if you apply an intonaco layer on top of that, it will behave very differently than if you apply it on coffee, for instance. Number four is a mixture of marble grits and marble dust. Marble grits as well is quite coarse and creates specific effects. And then you can also tint these mixtures. There is some dye that I found with Kramer called the XSL dyes that is used in number 5, where I mixed sand and marble dust and tinted it with black dye, so you also create a dark base layer. And then in number 6, you really have a mixture of sand and marble dust that is not tinted. And these sands, in our workshop last year, we actually went to Boston Beach and gathered some sand. Not too much. They don't appreciate it too much. But if you just go and grab a couple of handfuls of local sand, I think it's also a very nice idea to include the ground that you were working on into your painting. Here are some samples of arrillos that were created during our workshop last year by these students. And you can see you can already start to create a composition depending on what kind of arrillo materials you use underneath. So they're very different, already displaying the personality of the painters. And that's another thing that I really appreciate about this technique, is that you can express your individual voices very easily. As I mentioned, you can use different types of sands, or you can incorporate locally sourced material you do find around you, even tint them before applying the atonical layer. And that is where creativity comes in the choice and composition of these base materials. You can really experiment with different textures and even pre-color them, opening a whole new world of expressive possibilities. These base layers do not only offer a rich visual potential, but they're excellent and serve as great bonding surfaces that are ideal to embed textiles or collage elements. As you can see on Rita's work, where she really embedded a whole piece of tissue into the arillo, this approach creates an additional tactile and visual dimension that helps you to express what you would love to express. After the arillos are applied, what we're doing is to prepare the last and final plaster layer, the so-called intonaco. And as you can see, we are mixing a ratio of 50% marble dust and 50% pit lime into this creamy, lovely, wonderful substance that we then apply onto the work with a spatula. Because we are applying different arillos and deviate from the traditional rules of a fresco, the final layer, the intonaco, does not dry evenly as it does on a traditional fresco. Instead, it creates cracks that give these works their unique and ethereal expression, which I love so much. Without even applying a dash of color, you can see how interesting they are already after the drying process. So if we look at Karen's work here, where she just implemented a small piece of collage on the upper left side of the painting, but all the rest is just pure arillo and fresco. And look what it did overnight. I think it's already fascinating and has a big story to tell. Now, if we look at Kathy's work, that compared to what we just saw from Karen, which is a fresco secco, meaning she let the surface dry before she will apply color, this is a buon fresco, meaning Kathy applied some walnut stain ink onto the wet fresco surface, and overnight the color started to dilute and create these lines and color fields on her work. A similar process on this piece that includes collage in addition to the one we saw before. So the first picture is really a mixture of arillos, and on the lower part there is some intonaco applied. The middle picture displays the piece the next day after the drying process. You see these beautiful cracks. And the third one is really the final piece where I removed the collage element. These stripes is some paper I collaged into the wet surface. applied them on a different part of the painting and worked with encaustic on top of it. A similar process on this piece that was created during the residency in 2022. So it started as well with a regio layer made of coffee, and then the intonico layer applied on top of it, wet in wet. Then the middle picture shows you what I found the next morning, and here you can see that these cracks, they can vary substantially. This was really due to a very fast drying process. I had the piece out in the sun and it dried very fast. That usually produces larger cracks. And but it was very interesting, but also led to some decay. So the intonico didn't really bond very well with the aricio underneath. But then the task really is to integrate that into your work. So the picture on the right hand side is the final piece. I added some more of the walnut ink plus some blue inks and blue colors I had on site during the residency and added encaustic at the end. That being said, is you cannot only add color to these fresco pieces by applying encaustic color. You can also use casein, you can use inks, you can use dyes. There is a whole range of possibilities of materials you can work with. In this next session, I would like to show you some results of pieces that were created during this residency, where it was all about combining fresco and encaustic. And one of the key lessons I learned, if you ever go on a residency abroad, take as little material as possible. Because what really triggers your creativity and what triggers new works is if you need to improvise, if you need to look for solutions on site, if you need to work with materials you've never touched before. I think that really sparks creativity and can help you to develop a new body of work. This is one of my favorite pieces, and it was shown in the Jeff Soderbergh Gallery in Wellfleet last year, and it's found a new home, which is lovely. What is so special about this piece is that the middle part is tar paper, and that is a material I only discovered while I was in the residency because a fellow artist, Caroline Wenning, actually used it for her work. And it became an important part of the series I created during the residency. And it was fascinating to see how it reacted and collaborated with the materials I brought with me. That's another tar paper piece. It's a collage. It is made from different pieces I prepared and reassembled. So there was a lot of destruction involved and creating new combinations. Besides combining encaustic and fresco, I also chose a color I primarily wanted to work with, and it was a color that was completely out of my comfort zone. It was pink, and I never really used pink so explicitly in my previous work. And it was a fabulous journey to discover all the facets and all the possibilities this color offers. So this is another collage piece. You see on the bottom there is some tar paper, there are some tea bags, there are some cheesecloth and fresco parts that were being reassembled. And if I'm not mistaken, this piece is still on display in the Jeff Soderbergh Gallery in Wellfleet. So if you would love to have a closer look at the pieces, it's absolutely worth to visit the gallery because he has a lot of really worthwhile seeing artists exhibiting in his space, and it's hard to take photographs that do the work justice, actually. So if you can see them in real, it might be worth. This is one of my favorites, and what I think makes it so strong is that you can feel it went through a very rough process. There's a lot of destruction involved, dealing with the decay. So if you look at the right side of the painting, you can see that there used to be fresco in tonaco on top of it, but through the tearing apart of the different pieces, it fell off. But at the end, for the composition of the piece, it just adds a very interesting texture, and it's an important part that completes the painting. This piece as well is still at the Jeff Soderbergh Gallery in Wellfleet. And last but not least, this is the Rosy Finger Dawn. Again, tea bags that my fellow students, saved for me and brought me to my studio so I could integrate them into my work. Now that we're coming to the end of today's presentation, I hope you enjoyed it and it answered some of your questions. But knowing that there are so many more questions out there, and there are also a couple of people who have written to me asking if I'm offering an online class, what I'm planning to do is to actually do that, because given the current situation in the US, I have not planned to travel across the Atlantic in the near future. Should you be intrigued by the possibilities of the fusion of encaustic and fresco techniques, I invite you to sign up to the waitlist for the upcoming online workshop. And if you're on the waitlist, what it ensures is that you will get exclusive early access to the registration. You will receive some updates before the workshop starts, and you have the best chance to secure your spot before the workshop fills up, as seats will be limited. The way you can do it is scan the QR code here to the right, and this will lead you to a form where you can leave your name and email address. And voila, that's all you need to do to be on the wait list. The class will be a hybrid version of an online workshop, meaning we will offer pre-recorded videos that you can watch at your own pace. You can repeatedly watch them as often as you need to. And then there will be live sessions where we will get together, ask and answer your questions, and look at the progress of your work. It would be fabulous to have you on board and to see you in that class. Here we are at the end of the presentation. I would love to close it with a quote I found from Helen Frankenthaler, who was living on Cape Cod several summers as well. She said, apparently, "There are no rules. That is how art is born, how breakthroughs happen. Go against the rules or ignore the rules. That is what invention is about." In that spirit, I wish you a very successful creative journey. I hope you are inspired and dare to take risks. Keep on learning the rules to be able to break them and make your best work. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope we get a chance to hang out soon in the near future. Bye-bye.